gather close, for this tale thunders with ancient power. In the war of gods and monsters, few were as feared or as mighty as the one-eyed giants, the Cyclops, builders of walls, forgers of lightning, and destroyers of ships. Their story is carved into stone, fire, and legend. If you love stories where gods rage and giants rise, then like the video and subscribe. It helps more than you know, and there's so much more myth to come. The younger Cyclops were a group of wild, one-eyed giants who lived on the island called Hyperia, a place later believed by the Greeks to be the same as Sicily. These Cyclops were not refined beings, but rather primitive creatures who lived in caves carved into the rugged sides of mountains. Their lives were simple and harsh, consisting mostly of herding sheep across the rocky slopes of their island. They were not farmers and did not work the land. Instead, they took what they needed from the earth without effort, gathering what the land gave them freely without sowing or reaping. These giants lived without the rules of civilization. They had no cities, no shared laws, and no organized community. Each one lived separately with his wives and children in his own dark cave, ruling his household with complete and unquestioned power. Among this tribe of giants, Polyphemus stood out as the strongest and tallest. He was different not just in size but in origin as well, for he was not born from the blood of the earth like the others, but was instead the son of the sea god Poseidon. This gave him a divine connection, setting him apart from the rest of his kin. The others were said to be born from the earth itself, children of Gaia, brought forth when the sky god Uranus was overthrown. When Uranus was castrated, his blood fell onto the earth, and from that blood sprang many beings, including the Gigantes, the Phaeacians, and the Cyclopes. These three races were said to be closely related, sharing a savage primal origin and an ancient connection to the gods. They were all born in that violent moment when the heavens bled into the earth, giving rise to powerful and often dangerous children. The Cyclops, in particular, were known for their lack of concern for the gods. Unlike earlier times when divine beings lived among mortals and were honored with feasts and sacrifices, these Cyclops did not care for such rituals. They lived outside the influence of Olympus and ignored the authority of Zeus. Though they descended from the same world as the gods, they no longer served them or recognized their rule. This independence made them feared and hated by others. The name Cyclops itself means circle-eyed, referring to the single eye that sat in the middle of each giant's forehead. While Homer, in his great poem The Odyssey, did not say clearly whether all Cyclops had one eye, he did describe Polyphemus, the most famous among them, as having just one. This detail became central to their image in stories that followed. These beings were described as monstrous, lawless, and huge in size. They were shepherds, yet their flocks were not raised with care but rather kept for their own greed and hunger. They were even known to eat human flesh when strangers dared to enter their land, making them a terrifying threat to any traveler who wandered too close to their caves. Still, it is important to remember that the Cyclops were not all the same. The younger tribe that lived on Hyperia, including Polyphemus, were quite different from the ancient Cyclops who came before them. Those elder Cyclops were a noble and powerful group, not savage brutes. They had helped the gods themselves during the Great War against the Titans. These elder Cyclops had forged the most powerful weapons ever known: the thunderbolts of Zeus, the trident of Poseidon, and the helmet of Hades. With their craft and strength, they helped bring about the downfall of the old rulers of the cosmos and ensured the rise of the Olympian gods. These elder Cyclops, though sometimes also said to dwell on Sicily, were not the same as the sheep-herding giants of Hyperia. Their role was more divine, their work more refined, and their names remembered not for terror, but for creation. Still, both groups, young and old, were tied by their single eye and their giant forms. The connection between the Cyclops, the giants, and the Phaeacians was remembered in ancient stories, with all three said to be close to the gods, not only in their birth, but also in how they were treated by divine beings. The Phaeacians, for instance, were said to have shared meals with gods and recognized them easily, even when they walked in mortal form. This closeness was something that the Cyclops once shared as well, though the younger tribe had long since lost it. In the world of myth, these ancient connections explained how strange and powerful beings could exist outside human understanding. The Cyclops, born from earth and sky, were reminders of a time before civilization, when raw strength and primal forces shaped the world. Their one eye, their wild homes, and their brutal ways showed a life untouched by order. They were part of the Earth's deep memory, creatures who carried within them the chaos of their violent birth. And yet, even among these fierce giants, there were differences between those who helped the gods and those who defied them, between those who forged mighty weapons and those who ate men raw, between the noble and the savage. In every telling, their story carried the weight of ancient power and the mystery of a world shaped by blood and stone. In the distant past, there was a time when a people known as the Phaeacians lived in a place called Hyperia, a land that was near the territory of the Cyclops, a powerful and fearsome race of giants. These Cyclops were stronger and more brutal than the Phaeacians, and they constantly raided them, taking what they pleased with no resistance. The Phaeacians could not defend themselves against such relentless plundering. They lived in fear and suffered at the hands of their towering neighbors, who had no sense of justice or mercy. Tired of this suffering, their king, Nausithous, made the difficult decision to lead his people away from their ancestral land. He took them across the sea and settled them in a new land called Scheria, a distant island untouched by the violence of the Cyclopes, where they could live in peace and freedom. Much later, a different story began when a group of weary travelers came upon the land of the Cyclops, and among them was a clever man who observed the nature of these beings with great care. He saw that they were arrogant and lived without laws or any kind of political order. These Cyclops had no councils or assemblies where decisions were made, no traditions from their ancestors to guide their lives. Each one lived separately in caves high on the hills, with only his family around him, and ruled his own little world without caring about others. They were lawless in every sense, and instead of working for their food, they left everything to the gods. They did not plough the earth or sow seeds, but still their land bore fruit. Wheat, barley, and grapes grew in abundance, nurtured only by the rain sent from the sky. The Cyclops lived a life of ease, yet they had no ships or craftsmen to build them. This made them isolated, for they could not travel to other lands or learn from other people. Just off the coast of their country was a small island, filled with woods, and home only to goats that wandered freely. This island had never been touched by men, never ploughed or sown, because the Cyclops had no boats to reach it. They could see it from their shores, but it remained empty and quiet, a place of potential that they had no means to explore. It was in this strange and savage land that the travelers arrived. As they approached, they could see smoke rising in the distance, and they heard voices calling out and the sound of sheep and goats bleating in the hills. When they reached the shore, they saw a huge cave by the sea, shaded by bay trees, and beside it was a great courtyard with high walls made of stone and tall trees rising above them. This was the home of a lone Cyclops, a giant who lived apart from his kind. He did not join with others but stayed to himself, wandering with his flocks across the fields. He was not a man who followed the ways of justice or kindness. He lived by his own strength, caring only for his animals and his hunger. He was like a towering rock, a peak of the mountains, vast and terrifying in size. The travelers, cautious and unsure of what they would find, left most of their group behind to guard their ship and went forward with a smaller number, the bravest among them. They walked toward the cave, hoping perhaps to find shelter or food, but also knowing that they might be walking into danger. They feared that the being they might meet would not be kind or fair, but would be a brute whose strength replaced any sense of law. When they reached the cave, they found it empty, for the Cyclops was away with his sheep and goats. Inside, they saw the signs of his life: flat baskets filled with cheese, pens full of young animals, and tools made for handling milk and curds. Everything was large, built to match the size of the monstrous being who lived there. The place smelled of animals and was filled with the sounds of bleating. The walls of the cave loomed high, and the darkness inside was thick and still. The travelers looked around and took in the strange life of this creature who had no need for society or rules. They waited, knowing that soon the owner of the cave would return, and when he did, the ground trembled beneath his steps. The sheep and goats came back first, crowding into the pens, and behind them came the giant, filling the mouth of the cave with his shadow. His shoulders were broad, and his arms were like tree trunks. His eye, the single one in the middle of his forehead, looked over everything with a dull light. He carried a huge piece of stone, which he used to block the entrance to the cave, sealing it like a lid on a jar. Inside, the air grew heavy. The travelers hid, watching in silence as the Cyclops went about his evening tasks, milking the sheep, separating the curds, and preparing his meal. He still had not noticed them, but soon he would. What followed was a moment of fear, a moment where strength and cleverness would be tested. This Cyclops, unlike any man, unlike any beast, lived without fear of gods or men. He was a creature of the old world, shaped by a time before order, before laws, before the world had taken its proper shape. And now he stood between the travelers and their escape, a wall of flesh and rage, born not to listen or reason, but to take what he wanted and crush what stood in his way. The cave, once a place of quiet stone and wood, now became a prison, and what had begun as a journey across the sea had led to the heart of darkness, where the light of civilization could not reach. Baskets filled with cheeses were stacked neatly within the great cavern, arranged in rows that showed a sense of careful organization, despite the wildness of the place. Nearby, pens were packed with lambs and young goats, but even these were not jumbled together. They were divided thoughtfully by age, first the oldest, then the middle-born, and finally the youngest kept apart from the others. All around were vessels for dairy, crafted in different sizes, some large, some small, and each of them brimming with whey. The air was thick with the scent of curd and animal musk. The place told of someone who, though savage in many ways, still maintained a kind of method and order in the keeping of his animals and the making of his food. In that moment, curiosity pulled me forward. I wanted to see the master of this strange dwelling, to know who lived in such a towering cave with such abundance. I had hope, a faint hope, that he might receive us as guests and follow the sacred customs of hospitality, perhaps even offering the traditional gifts that were expected between guest and host. But fate had other plans, and what awaited us was no warm welcome. We built a fire and feeling the hunger rise after our long journey, reached out for some of the cheeses. Before tasting them, we took care to honor the gods first, setting aside a portion in reverence, hoping it might win us their favor. Then we ate the rest in silence and waited, shadows flickering across the walls from the firelight, the sound of wind brushing past the cave's mouth. At last, he came. We heard him before we saw him. A heavy tread, the shifting of great weight, and then the figure of the Cyclops appeared, a monstrous shape guiding his flocks before him. Over his shoulders, he carried a thick bundle of dry firewood, gathered for his evening meal. He stepped into the cave and let it drop with a crash that echoed through the stone hollow, and we shrank instinctively into the shadows, fear gripping us. He drove in part of his flock, his milking ewes and milking goats, while the stronger rams and he-goats were left outside in the walled yard. Then, as casually as if he were lifting a stone for a garden wall, he picked up a vast boulder, far beyond the strength of ordinary men. It was said that even 22 strong wagons could not have moved it from the ground, yet he rolled it into place and blocked the cave's entrance with ease, sealing us inside. Once this was done, he settled into his routine. He sat down and began milking his ewes and goats, one after the other, working methodically. Then he placed the young lambs and kids beside their mothers. With practiced hands, he curdled half the milk and pressed it into curds, stacking the finished cheese into the woven baskets. The rest he left in the pails, setting it aside for his supper. It was a rhythm he knew well, a task he had done many times, and he performed it with simple efficiency. But then he turned toward the fire, and the flickering light revealed us where we sat. His single eye landed on our group, and everything changed. He looked at us without kindness or surprise, only with a cold curiosity. Then he asked, his voice booming off the cave walls, who we were and what land we had come from. He wanted to know if we were traders, traveling across the sea in peace, or if we were pirates, roaming from coast to coast to bring ruin to others. The sound of his voice shook us. It was deep and violent, and paired with the terrifying sight of his immense body and one-eyed gaze, it crushed our courage. We stood silent for a moment, hearts sinking under the weight of what we faced, but I gathered what little strength I had left and answered him. I told him we were from the land of the Achaeans, that we had fought at Troy and now journeyed home. I said we had come to his land, not to harm but to seek shelter, following the custom that demands kindness to those who arrive as strangers. I asked for the honor of being received, reminded him of the sacred duty hosts had toward guests, and invoked the name of Zeus, the god who watches over all who wander far from home, the god who guards the rights of the guest and the suppliant. But he responded without pause and without mercy. He called me a fool, or perhaps someone who came from too far away to understand his kind. He told me that he cared nothing for the gods or for Zeus, with all his thunder and strength. He said the Cyclops feared no one, neither gods nor men, and that Zeus had no power over them. With those words, the last hope faded. It was clear now that this was no place of sanctuary, and the being before us was no host. He followed no law of gods or men. He was alone in the world, bound only to his own will, and we were now at the mercy of his whims. Trapped in his cave with the stone blocking the exit and surrounded by his strength, we understood what kind of danger we had stumbled into. There was no reasoning with him, no appeal to divine justice, and no escape from what was to come. The firelight flickered. The cave seemed to close in tighter, and the Cyclops towered over us like a mountain come to life. We had entered his world, and it was a place without mercy. The Cyclops, in his terrible pride, declared that he and his kind had no fear of the gods in the sky, for they were far stronger than those who dwelled on high. He said no threat from Zeus would ever cause him to show mercy, not unless he chose to do so on his own, and certainly not because of fear. His words were cold and his intent was clear, but still, he wanted something from me. He asked where we had moored our ship, whether it was nearby or far along the coast. His tone was casual, but I understood what he really meant. He was trying to find our ship, not to welcome us or protect it, but to destroy it and trap us forever. I knew the danger, and so I gave him false words, telling him that Poseidon had shattered our ship against the rocks and that it had sunk, leaving us stranded. I watched his face for any hint of change, but he gave no reply. Instead, he rose suddenly, his huge body moving with speed that didn't match his size, and he reached out with his hands. Without hesitation, he grabbed two of my companions, one in each hand, and slammed them onto the ground with such force that their skulls cracked open and their brains spilled out across the cave floor. Their lives ended in an instant, and we stood frozen, powerless to stop it. Then, like a beast of the wild, he tore their bodies apart limb by limb and devoured them. He ate them completely, flesh, bones, entrails and marrow, with no care or thought, just hunger. He ate like a lion of the mountains, greedy and brutal, and we, the survivors, could only watch in horror, our faces wet with tears, our hands raised in silent prayer to Zeus, hoping for mercy, though we knew it would not come. When the Cyclops had eaten his fill, his great belly bloated with flesh and washed down with raw milk, he lay down among his sheep and goats. His body stretched across the floor, massive and heavy, and the beast moved around him without fear. As he slept, I felt rage rise inside me, burning with the thought of what he had done. I thought to take my sword and thrust it deep into his chest, to feel for the place where the liver lies beneath the ribs, and end his life while he lay helpless. My fingers brushed the hilt, and I took a step toward him. But then reason returned. If I killed him now, we would never escape, for the stone that sealed the cave's mouth was too heavy for any of us to move. We would die in the dark beside the monster we had slain. So I held back and turned away, and we sat in misery, waiting for dawn, hearts full of grief and hatred. When dawn arrived, its light soft and rosy on the cave's mouth, the Cyclops stirred and rose again. He went about his tasks as before, lighting the fire, milking the animals, and placing the young beside their mothers. His hands moved with practiced ease, uncaring and unmoved by what he had done. Then he reached for two more of my companions and ended their lives as he had the others, making his breakfast from their broken bodies. There was no struggle, no resistance, only the sound of bones snapping and the awful silence that followed. When he had eaten, he moved the great stone once more, lifting it as if it were nothing more than the lid of a quiver, and led his flock out into the daylight. He led them away with a whistle, disappearing into the hills, while we were left alone with the dead and the echo of his cruelty. I sat in the silence, thinking and thinking, wondering if there was a way to strike back. If there was a chance, even a small one, that vengeance could be ours and glory might be won. I turned the thought over and over, waiting for some idea to take shape, something that could match the size of our enemy and the weight of our loss. Then, near the sheep pen, I saw something that caught my eye. The Cyclops had left behind a great piece of olive wood, torn from the tree but still green and heavy. It was meant to be a walking staff for him once it had dried, but to us it looked more like the mast of a mighty ship, the kind rowed by 20 men. It was long and thick, a massive thing, even in that cave of giants, and as I stared at it, a plan began to form. I measured it with my eyes and saw that it might serve our purpose. With careful hands we trimmed off a length as much as we could manage, and then smoothed and shaped it into a point. We hardened it in the fire until it glowed, red and fierce, then hid it under a pile of dung where he would not see it. Our hearts pounded with fear and hope, for we knew that what we were about to attempt would either save us or destroy us all. And so we waited for the monster to return, the sharpened stake hidden, the plan in our minds, the memory of our fallen friends burning behind our eyes as we prepared for the night to fall again. The great beam of olive wood lay before us, immense and rough, freshly torn from the tree, its bark still clinging in patches, its surface uneven and green. I stepped toward it, gauging its size and strength, and with my own hands I cut off a section, a length of 6 feet, thick and sturdy, heavy enough to challenge the strength of many men. Once it was separated from the whole, I placed it in front of my companions and asked them to help prepare it. They took it without question and began to smooth it down, scraping and shaving, removing the roughness from its surface until it was even and straight. Then I stepped forward again, this time sharpening one end into a sharp point, careful and precise, making it like a spear. When the point was ready, I carried it to the fire and held it in the hottest part of the flames, watching as the heat hardened the wood, darkened it, and made it strong enough to pierce even the thickest flesh. Once it had cooled, I took it and buried it deep in a pile of dung layered throughout the cave, hiding it from sight, covering it so that it would not be discovered too soon. Then I turned to my men and told them it was time to cast lots, to decide who would join me in this desperate act. I needed 4 to help me lift the stake and drive it into the giant's eye when sleep finally took him. The lots fell on those I would have chosen with my own hand, 4 brave men whose hearts matched the danger, and I made a 5th. As the sun slipped low and darkness came once more, the Cyclops returned to his cave, the sound of his heavy footsteps echoing across the land, his flocks bleating as they followed behind. This time, he did not leave even a single beast outside in the yard. He herded them all into the cavern, every one of them, as though something had warned him, or perhaps some divine will had touched his thoughts and led him to be cautious. Once again, he rolled the massive stone across the mouth of the cave, sealing us in. Then he sat down and repeated his daily tasks, milking the ewes and goats in the usual order, placing the young ones at their mothers' sides. When this was finished, he seized 2 more of my companions and ate them just as he had the others, without pause or thought, as if their lives meant nothing. My heart burned as I watched, but I held my fear and stepped forward, holding in my hands an ivy wood bowl filled to the brim with dark red wine, thick and fragrant. I offered the bowl to the Cyclops and spoke to him as he looked at me. I told him he had eaten enough flesh, and that now it was time to taste something else. I told him of the wine I had brought, meant as a gift for him, a drink I had saved in hopes that he would be kind, that he would pity us and help us return home. But his actions had gone far beyond reason. He had no mercy, no sense of right, and after what he had done, who would ever dare come near him again? He had broken every law that men and gods held sacred. He took the bowl from my hands and drank deeply. The scent of the wine pleased him, and he swallowed it down in great gulps, nodding with satisfaction. Then he asked for more, delighted by the taste, and told me to share my name with him so he could give me a gift, something he believed would make me glad. He said that even though his land bore grapes watered by Zeus's rain, grapes that made strong wine, This drink I had given him was like nectar and ambrosia, rich beyond anything he had ever known. So I gave him another bowl, and then another, and again a third. Each time he drank, careless and unaware, until the wine had taken hold of his mind and began to cloud his thoughts. It dulled his senses, softened his grip on the world, and wound itself around his reason like a snake. Once I saw that the moment was near, that his mind was drifting and his limbs growing heavy. I leaned close and spoke in a voice soft and humble, careful not to stir suspicion. He had asked my name, and now I was ready to give it. The plan was in motion. The stake lay hidden. The wine had done its work, and the night had begun its slow descent over the cave where fate waited in silence. The favor that he had promised me, and with the wine thick upon his breath and his mind dulled by its strength, I told him that my name was Nomen, that this was the name my mother had given me, and that my friends had always called me by it. He listened and responded with a cruel grin, saying that Nomen would be the last to be eaten, and that he would begin with my companions. This, he said, was the favor he would give me in return for the wine. And then, as though the gods themselves had closed his eyes, he fell heavily backward onto the floor of the cave, his massive form crashing down, his limbs sprawling and his thick neck sagging to one side as sleep overcame him at last. In his drunken stupor, he let out deep belches, and from his mouth spilled the foul remains of the men he had eaten. Chunks of human flesh and sour wine mixing together in a sickening stream. He groaned and twitched, but the grip of slumber held him fast, and I knew the time had come. I stepped quickly to the embers and dragged the great stake into the fire, burying its point deep among the coals until it glowed red and angry. The green wood hissed and cracked as flames licked around it, and I turned to my companions, speaking words of courage to steady their hands and remind them of the task that now lay before us. The heat of the fire grew stronger, and the sharpened tip of the olive stake began to glow with a fierce light, the smoke rising from it in long, curling strands. When I saw that the wood had grown hot enough to burn through flesh and bone, I pulled the stake from the fire, its point glowing with terrible power, and the others gathered close around me, each one taking hold. It was then that something greater than ourselves seemed to fill our hearts with courage, and we moved together without hesitation. Lifting the red-hot point of the stake, we ran at the giant where he lay snoring on the stone floor. With a great cry, we drove the burning wood into the center of his eye, plunging it deep and twisting with all our might. I pressed down from above, my weight forcing the stake further into the eye, and we spun it like a drill, the smoke and stench rising as flesh burned and hissed. Blood poured out in thick streams, running over the stake and hissing as it met the heat. The eyelid and the brow were scorched, the roots of the eye sizzled in the fire, and the smell of burnt bone filled the cave. The Cyclops awoke with a scream so loud it shook the stone walls. The sound echoed again and again, and in fear we scattered, running to the sides of the cave to avoid the flailing of his arms. He staggered up and tore the stake from his ruined eye, throwing it across the floor in a fit of agony, the end still glowing faintly with embers and soaked in blood. Blinded and bellowing, he cried out with a voice that roared through the night and rose up the hills, calling to his fellow Cyclops who lived in scattered caves among the high, wind-swept peaks. They heard him and came at once, their heavy steps crashing through the darkness as they approached his cave, their voices calling out in confusion, asking what had happened, what terrible pain had made him shout so loud and robbed them of their sleep. They called to him, asking if someone had stolen his sheep, or if some enemy was threatening his life. From inside the cave, the blinded giant answered in a voice full of misery and rage, telling them that it was no man who was hurting him, that no man had brought this pain, and that no man was killing him by trickery and not by force. When they heard this, the Cyclops standing outside were confused and shouted back to him, saying that if no man was hurting him and he was suffering alone, then surely it must be a sickness sent by the gods, a punishment from mighty Zeus himself, and that if this was the case, there was no remedy for him on earth. They told him to pray to his father, the god of the sea, and then they turned and went away, their footsteps fading into the hills as they left him to suffer alone. Inside the cave, I felt a silent laughter rise in my heart, knowing that my trick had worked, that the name I had chosen had fooled him completely, and that his own words had turned help away from his door. He groaned and screamed, stumbling through the darkness, clutching at the walls, his eye pouring blood, his pain too great for words. He moved to the doorway of the cave and pushed aside the great stone that sealed the entrance, rolling it away with a strength that was still terrible despite his injury. Then he sat in the mouth of the cave, feeling for any who might try to pass, stretching out his arms to trap us if we dared to flee. He groped at the ground, hoping to catch the ones who had blinded him, but we stayed still, hidden in the shadows, waiting and watching, while he wept and called on his father in vain. The cave, once a place of terror, had now become a place of silence and dread, and the air hung heavy with smoke, blood, and the scent of revenge fulfilled. Himself with outstretched hands, hoping to seize on some of us passing into the open among the sheep. So witless did he take me to be, imagining perhaps that I would try to escape openly, trusting in speed or luck. But I had seen the size and strength of this brute, and I knew no force or open trick could save us. The cave was filled with large, strong rams, beasts well-fed and thick-fleeced, their wool dark and heavy, the kind that had long grazed in peace on the hills and pastures of the land. Without making a sound, I began working in the dim light, my hands moving carefully, taking the plaited withies, the twisted cords made from plant fiber that the Cyclops used for his bedding, and using them for a different purpose. I worked swiftly, tying the rams together in groups of 3, binding them just tightly enough so they would move as one. In each group, I placed a man beneath the middle ram, lashing him in place so that his body was hidden beneath the animal's thick belly. The 2 rams on either side moved freely and covered him on both flanks, walking beside him like silent guards. In this way, one man was hidden between 3 beasts, and one by one I prepared my companions this way, securing each man with the soft cords so the brute would not detect them. When they were ready, I turned to my own escape. Among all the flock, there was one ram that stood above the rest, stronger, fatter, and with wool thicker than any other. I chose him for myself. I slipped beneath his great belly and twisted my limbs tightly around his chest, curling my body upwards and gripping with all the strength I had left. His fleece was soft and warm, but I could feel the pounding of his heart through my arms and chest, and I knew the moment was near. Like this, in utter silence, we waited in the dark for the coming of the dawn, our hearts filled with fear, yet clinging to hope. Dawn came at last, early and soft, with her rosy fingers spreading light into the shadowed world. The rams stirred and began to walk toward the entrance, eager for the open fields, while the ewes, still unmilked, stood around the pens bleating with udders heavy and full. The sound filled the cave, and yet the giant, though racked with pain and half-blinded rage, rose once more to carry out his grim task. He stood by the mouth of the cave, and as each ram approached, he reached out with both hands and felt along their backs, running his fingers over their wool to check if anyone clung to their sides or backs. His touch was heavy, but it was only along the tops of their bodies, never underneath, and so he found nothing. One by one, the animals passed by him, and one by one, my companions escaped, hidden under the bellies of those gentle beasts. Last of all came the ram I had chosen, the strongest and slowest because of his size and the burden he carried. The Cyclops noticed the delay and stopped him, placing both hands upon his back. He spoke to him, calling him by the fond tone of one who had loved and trusted the beast, wondering aloud why this ram, once always first to leave and first to return, was now the last to exit the cave. He spoke with grief, blaming the sorrow of the ram on his own misfortune, saying the animal must surely be mourning the loss of his master's eye, which had been destroyed by that hateful guest named Noman, whose evil had bested him with drink and deceit. He declared that if only the ram could think and speak, he would be able to help take vengeance. The beast gave no answer, only shifted his weight slightly under the pressure of my hidden body, and after a long pause, the Cyclops let him go, pushing him gently through the doorway and out into the morning light. Once we had moved far enough from the cave and the stone courtyard, I released my grip on the ram, sliding down from beneath his belly and landing softly on the ground. My arms ached, my body sore from clinging so long in silence, but I wasted no time. I turned to the other animals and began to untie my companions, freeing each one and helping them to stand. We were alive, we were whole, and though shaken and scarred, we had survived. Without delay, we gathered the sheep, choosing the plumpest and strongest among them, and drove them quickly down the slope, hearts pounding with the knowledge that the monster might yet pursue us. We reached the ship, our feet light with desperation, our eyes scanning the land for signs of movement. The crew on board, who had waited with fear and doubt, saw us and rushed to meet us, pulling the animals aboard and readying the vessel. We set sail at once, pushing out into the sea, and only when we were far enough, no more than a man's loud voice could carry over the waves, did I turn back. I stood on the deck and raised my voice to the shore, shouting across the water, calling out to the blinded Cyclops and throwing words like stones, daring to mock him now that we were beyond his reach. He heard me, and from the cave his howl rose once again, but we were already slipping further into the open sea, the waves carrying us onward, away from the island, away from the darkness, and away from the one-eyed brute who had brought us so close to death. Not quite defenseless, the man whose friends had been torn apart and devoured so brutally within the darkness of that savage cave. I had survived, and the horror he had unleashed would not go unpunished. He had shown no shame in feeding on those who came to him as guests, breaking the sacred laws that even the gods upheld. He had committed violence beneath his own roof, ignoring the customs of welcome, and for that the gods would remember. I cried out across the sea, naming his crimes, telling him that this was the justice of Zeus and the other immortals. But no sooner had my voice reached in him than rage overtook him. Blinded and furious, he groped along the shore, and then, with a scream of wrath, he ripped the top from a towering cliff and hurled it blindly toward the sound of my voice. The massive stone cut through the sky, and with a terrible crash it landed just in front of our ship, splashing into the sea with such weight that the water rose high around it. The wave rolled back from the impact, swelling and surging, striking the hull and throwing the vessel toward the land again, the foam slapping against the sides and rocking us in the current. Panic gripped us, and I seized a long pole, thrusting it hard against the water and pushing us away from the incoming wave. I turned to my companions and with sharp motions urged them to row, to press their strength into the oars and flee while there was still time. They obeyed at once, bending their backs and pulling hard, their arms straining, their faces pale with fear, the sea churning behind us as the great swell receded. But as soon as we were twice the distance out from the shore, farther from the danger yet still within earshot, I could not contain the fire in my chest. Though my companions on both sides tried to stop me, begging me not to speak again, warning that another word would provoke the giant to further wrath, I would not be silent. They pleaded, reminding me of the rock that had nearly crushed us and how close we had come to death, how another throw could break the hull or take our lives. But the fury in me would not be stilled, and I called out once more, my voice sharp across the water. I shouted my name, no longer hiding behind trickery. I told him that it was not Noman who had blinded him, but Odysseus, the sacker of cities, son of Laertes, from the land of Ithaca. My voice carried over the waves, strong with triumph and defiance, revealing the truth that I had once hidden. He groaned when he heard it, his cry echoing off the rocks, and then he answered with sorrow and dread. He said the name struck him like a hammer, for long ago a prophecy had been spoken to him. In his land there had been a prophet, a great man named Telemos, son of Eurymos, who lived among the Cyclops in his old age and saw the fates of those around him. That seer had once foretold that the day would come when Polyphemus would be blinded by a man named Odysseus. That warning had echoed in his mind over the years, but he had imagined it would be a hero of towering stature, a warrior mighty and strong, someone visibly great and powerful, someone fit to match the gods. But now, he lamented, it was a small man, a frail and cunning wanderer who had stolen his sight, not with might or blade, but with wine and clever speech. His pride was broken, and he called out once more, begging me to return. He promised gifts, offerings befitting a guest, and said he would pray to the Earthshaker, his father, to grant me safe passage home. He revealed then that he was a son of Poseidon, and that only Poseidon, among all the gods and men, had the power to heal his ruined eye, if he chose to do so. But his pleas found no pity in me, and though he had spoken of gifts and prayers, I had seen too much to be fooled again. I wished not only to escape him, but to be rid of him entirely. I longed not just for my own safety, but for vengeance complete. And in my heart, I wished that I could take from him more than sight, that I could take his very life. If only the gods had given me that certainty, I would have seized it without pause, ending the terror he had brought upon me and mine. But the winds were already pushing us outward, and the sea was opening before us. The island grew smaller in the distance, the cries of the blinded Cyclops fading behind us, his curses rising to the heavens as he stretched his arms toward the sky, calling on his father in wrath and sorrow, begging that I might never reach my homeland, or if I did, that it would be long delayed, through suffering and the loss of all I held dear. And though the sea rolled on and the ship sailed forward, the shadow of his words would linger long, for the gods do not always forget, and even the proudest heart cannot escape every curse that is spoken with blood. Being, and send you down to Hades' this house, for I was certain then that no one would ever heal the eye you lost, not even the god you call Father, not even the Earthshaker himself. These were the last words I shouted across the waves, and no sooner had they reached his ears than he raised his arms toward the sky, stretching his hands up through the sea-scented air and calling on Poseidon, the dark-haired god who holds the earth in place, to hear his cry. He prayed with all the strength of his wounded soul, screaming into the sky that if indeed he was Poseidon's son, if the Lord of the sea truly acknowledged him as his own, then may he curse my fate. May he prevent me from ever seeing my homeland again. And if it was already fated that I would return, if no curse could undo what destiny had decided, then may I return only after long suffering, alone and broken, without a single friend left beside me, carried on a foreign ship and cast upon distant shores. And even then, if I must reach home, may home itself turn against me. May evil wait there in silence to destroy my peace. So the Cyclops cried to the heavens, and in that moment the god of the sea, the one who stirs the waters and shakes the land, heard him and took his side. The air thickened as the prayer was received, and the sea itself seemed to grow heavier with meaning. Then the monster reached down again, his hands grasping for another stone, this one greater than the first, vaster in weight and rage. He hurled it with all his might, and it tore through the sky with a deep rushing sound, landing just behind our dark prowed ship, so close that the spray soaked our backs and the wood beneath us shuddered. The stones struck the sea with such force that the water surged forward in a mighty wave. But instead of dragging us down, the wave pushed us ahead, carrying us further and flinging us onward to the far shore. And so we escaped his reach, but we did not escape the shadow of his curse. For even as the ship sped forward, the name of the Earthshaker hung over us like a storm not yet broken. His anger would not fade, for the one whose eye I had taken was no common brute, but a child of sea and nymph, born of Teusa, the daughter of the ancient sea lord Phorcys, and sired in the dark curling hollows of the sea by Poseidon himself. Among all the Cyclops, this one was the strongest, the greatest in power, and now he had been wounded not by a god, but by a man. Ever since that moment, Poseidon's wrath clung to me like a tide that would not recede, and long after we had left that cursed island behind, his fury shaped the course of my journey, stretching time and space, scattering my men and delaying my return, for no slight against a son of the sea goes unanswered by the Lord of Storms. Even in later tellings, the story remained the same. The land of the Cyclops was approached cautiously, its shores marked by cliffs and scattered caves, far from the ports of ordinary men. We had left the other ships behind on a nearby island and taken only one to the Cyclops shore, where we stepped onto the land with 12 companions, not knowing the fate that waited in the hills. Not far from the waves stood a vast cave, dark and echoing, where a terrible creature made his home, a wild man of monstrous size, a devourer of flesh, with a single eye burning in the center of his forehead. He was the son of Poseidon and Teusa, and his name was Polyphemus. I carried with me a flask of wine, a gift from Meron, a man of the god's grove, and this wine would become the key to our survival. Inside the cave, we found the tools and signs of a shepherd's life, pens for flocks, pails for milk, and cheeses laid out to dry. We made a fire and sacrificed young goats, preparing to eat and hoping the master of the cave would return in peace. But when he came, everything changed. With his massive arms, he drove his flock inside and rolled a boulder across the entrance, sealing us in. He saw us, and without hesitation reached down and took 2 of my men, smashing their bodies and eating them raw. We were frozen with horror, and I knew then that only cunning could save us. I offered him the wine, sweet and strong, and he drank deeply, asking for more. When the wine dulled his mind and made him stumble, he asked my name. I told him I was nobody, and in return he promised to eat me last, a cruel joke that he thought was mercy. He drank again and again until the sleep of wine overtook him. Then, when the cave fell into silence and his breathing slowed, I I and 4 companions found a great club left lying in the shadows. We sharpened it, hardened it in the fire, and when it glowed red, we plunged it into his eye while he lay helpless. He roared, and the cave echoed with pain, but we had already begun the plan for our escape. The next morning, as he sat at the cave's mouth, feeling each ram that passed to make sure no man escaped, I clung to the underside of the largest ram, hiding beneath its thick wool. One by one, we slipped past him, tied beneath the bellies of his flock. He never found us, and when we reached the ship, we drove the animals aboard and pushed off. Then I shouted my name, and he cursed me with the full voice of his blood. That curse, called into the wind and sea, was heard. Poseidon would not forget. From that moment forward, my path was no longer mine alone. It belonged to the will of the gods. The island vanished behind us, but the consequences of that day followed like a shadow on the waves. Fire and blinded the Cyclops. The searing point of the stake hissed as it sank into the soft center of his single eye, and the creature roared so loudly that the entire cave trembled. He stumbled and screamed, his massive hands flailing wildly as blood poured from the ruin where his sight had once been. In his agony, he called out to the other Cyclops who lived in the nearby caverns on the mountainside, those who, like him, dwelled in hollow caves far above the valleys, lawless and wild, each one ruling over his own household with no regard for his neighbors. They came quickly, alarmed by the noise, shouting and calling out to him, asking what had happened and who had brought him pain. But when he told them that nobody had harmed him, they grew confused, for it seemed to them that no one was responsible. If nobody had hurt him, then there was no reason to stay. Thinking his cries were nothing more than madness, or perhaps a sickness sent by the gods, they turned and returned to their caves, leaving him to suffer alone in the darkness. Blinded and burning with rage, he waited for dawn, and when the rosy light finally crept across the mouth of his cave, he pushed the great boulder aside and opened the entrance. Then he stood there, stooped and swollen with fury, placing himself like a living gate across the only exit, arms stretched wide and hands moving blindly across the backs of his sheep as they passed by him, hoping to catch a man in the act of escape. But cleverness had already outwitted brute strength. The men he sought were not among the sheep, but beneath them. Odysseus had bound his companions beneath the thick-bellied rams, tying them 3 by 3 with strips torn from the bedding in the cave. Each man lay hidden under the middle beast, shielded on either side by 2 more, their bodies pressed into the fleas, holding tight and moving silently. As for himself, he had chosen the finest ram of them all, the leader of the flock, and curled up beneath it, clutching its thick fur and clinging with all his might as the ram stepped slowly past the blinded master. The Cyclops, feeling each back, never once thought to search below, and so they slipped through his arms and into the open. When the last of the flock had passed and the men were free, they untied themselves and fled quickly to the shore. There the ship waited, and they drove the stolen sheep before them as they ran. They loaded the animals aboard, and then, taking up their oars, they pushed out into the sea. As the ship moved through the water, the one who had planned the escape stood at the stern and could not hold his tongue. With the wind behind him and the distance between them growing, he shouted back to the blinded Cyclops, revealing his name and taunting the one who had failed to hold them. Hearing the name Odysseus, the monster cried out again, and the sound was not of pain but of understanding. A prophecy had once been spoken to him by a great seer, a man known for truth among his kind. That seer had told him long ago that a man named Odysseus would one day take his sight, and now, too late, the prophecy had come true. with fury redoubled by the weight of fate. The Cyclops ripped massive stones from the cliffs and hurled them toward the sound of the ship, the great rocks crashing into the sea. One fell just behind the dark-prowed vessel, missing the rudder by the width of a breath. The waves swelled and surged as the stone struck the water, lifting the ship and driving it forward, pushing it from danger by the very wrath that meant to destroy it. But the curse was not finished. From that moment on, Poseidon, the Earth-shaker, father of the wounded Cyclops, turned his eyes against the man who had brought his son such pain. The god's anger would follow Odysseus across the seas, stirring storms and casting him from island to island, delaying his return and scattering his companions. Others remembered this tale and the savage race it revealed. Plato, in his writings, used the Cyclops as a symbol of primitive rule, where each man led his own house and no laws existed beyond the reach of the cave. They lived apart, not in cities, but in wild places, high on the mountains, where no fields were ploughed and no vines were planted. Everything they ate grew without labor, and they took from the earth what they pleased, for the gods sent rain enough and the land was rich without effort. They had no councils, no gatherings to speak of justice, no rules shared between neighbors. Each one ruled alone, making decisions for wife and child, caring nothing for the next. Homer had described them this way, and others after him agreed. Strabo, the geographer, spoke of their life as a picture of early man, untouched by law or community, living in isolation and strength. Pausanias recalled how even the Phaeacians, a people close to the gods, were said to be kin to the Cyclopes and the giants, beings who stood at the edge of mortal understanding, powerful but distant, raw and unshaped. And Philostratus, looking at ancient paintings, saw Cyclops gathering grapes and harvesting fields, not by sowing or planting, but by simple taking, for the earth itself gave to them without toil. They lived in caves not just as homes, but as kingdoms of one, their strength making law and their hunger ruling all. And among them, one stood out, greater than the rest. Polyphemus, son of the sea god, and a nymph of the waves. His strength had been unmatched, his rage terrible, but even he had fallen not to a sword, but to a trick, not to a hero's might, but to a wanderer's mind. And from that fall came a storm that stretched across oceans, a wrath that touched every shore where the name Odysseus was spoken, and a warning passed down through ages of pride, of lawlessness, and of the sharpness of wit over brute power. Of their own accord the earth sends forth these its fruits for them. They are in truth Cyclopes, for whom, for reasons unknown, the poets have long insisted that the earth should yield its bounty freely, without the labor of hand or plough. In their lands the fields never know the mark of a harrow, nor are the shoulders of oxen burdened with yokes to pull heavy blades through soil. Instead, the earth, like a generous mother, lifts her riches to the surface with no asking, spreading grain and vine alike under open sky. The Cyclops do not toil, and yet their land feeds them. The soil gives birth to food without seed or furrow, and the vines curl of their own will, heavy with fruit. They are not builders of cities, nor do they shape temples or construct houses of stone. They do not gather in councils, nor sit in assemblies to speak of laws or governance. Each lives alone, apart from the others, settled in the deep clefts of high mountain ranges, where they carve no road and plant no field. The caves they dwell in are cold and vast, split into the mountainside like scars in the world. And in these dark hollows they live wild, their hearts untouched by order, their lives ruled only by strength and hunger. Among them is one greater than the rest, fierce beyond imagining, Polyphemus, the son of the sea god. He is the most savage of them all. His face is a strange and terrible sight, with a single brow that arcs thickly above his lone central eye, and a broad nose that flattens across his face like a shadow over his lip. His mouth is wide, his teeth made for tearing, and his hands are large enough to crush a man without effort. He does not dine as mortals do. He feasts like a lion of the wild, tearing flesh with his bare hands, grinding bone and muscle between his teeth, and drinking the blood that spills from his prey. What he craves is not the gifts of the earth, but the bodies of men, taken alive and broken for his pleasure. He is not alone in this. Others among the Cyclops share this same taste, and in the shadows of their mountain caverns, they wait for storms to drive ships toward their shores. When the sea rages and the winds howl, they climb from their caves and scan the waves, hoping that misfortune has brought fresh victims. At the edge of the rocks that rise above the sea, they lurk, watching for sails and listening for the crack of timber. Should a ship be driven close, they descend like predators, dragging the broken bodies of those inside back to their lairs. Polyphemus is their chief, and he takes his captives to the very edge of a rocky altar that juts over the sea, a place high and cruel where the ocean crashes far below. There he throws them down as an offering to his father Poseidon, believing this sacrifice will please the Earthshaker. Sometimes, when the men are strong and broad of shoulder, he does not hurl them immediately to their deaths. Instead, he challenges them to face him in combat, demanding they fight him with gauntlets, barehanded and desperate. To him, this is sport. To them, it is a cruel mockery of honor, for their fate is already sealed. The best among them are given this trial. The rest are simply slaughtered and devoured, their remains scattered across the stones. It is said that of all the deaths one might meet upon the sea, none is more dreadful than to fall into the grasp of the Cyclops. Others, in later years, spoke of this land and these people. Some called them wild men, untamed and mountain-born, and said that their very name was tied to stone, to the hard and ancient places of the world. Even in cities, the word Cyclopean was used to describe walls made of such vast and rough-hewn stones that no ordinary hands could have lifted them. It spoke of power without refinement, of size without grace. And some believed that it was these beings who had built such ancient ruins, their massive strength carving halls from cliffs and thrones from peaks. But all agreed on their nature. They were a race apart, savage and lonely, distant from the gods though descended from them, with no love for mankind and no law save their own will. The elder Cyclops were not like the younger ones. They were born at the beginning of the world, the sons of the sky and the earth, giants with a single eye and great wisdom in the art of fire and forge. When they were born, their father, fearing their strength, cast them into the depths of the earth, locking them away with other terrible children in the belly of the world. There they remained until the rise of the war between the Titans and the new gods. In that struggle, Zeus and his brothers broke open the earth and freed the Cyclopes. In gratitude, the ancient smiths forged for the gods their greatest weapons: thunderbolts for Zeus, the trident for Poseidon, and a helm of invisibility for Hades. These gifts helped the gods triumph, and the elder Cyclops were honored for their craft. But even they were fierce and fearsome, and the memory of their imprisonment never faded. Some say that more than 3 of them existed, and that 7 Cyclops in all worked at the forge, their hammers ringing through the heart of the mountains. But though they gave the gods their tools of power, they remained creatures of a wilder age, living close to fire and stone, far from the world of men. Whether forging lightning or feasting on flesh, the Cyclops stood always at the edge of the world, beings not fully divine, not wholly mortal, but something in between. Their story was one of strength without compassion, of hunger without end, and of a world before the shaping hand of law had touched the land. They were the first to hold the power of flame, and the last to speak no word of mercy. In their caves the winds still howl, and the earth, still without plough or seed, feeds them freely, as though the world itself has never dared to say no. Lesser four, sons of the first, were slain by Apollo to avenge the death of his son Asclepius, who had been struck down by Zeus with a thunderbolt forged by the elder Cyclops. These younger Cyclopes were not like the ancient three who had shaped the weapons of the gods, but sons of those immortal smiths, and though powerful in their own right, they could not escape the wrath of a god who grieved the loss of his son. The tribe of younger Cyclops that Odysseus encountered on his long journey belonged to a very different line altogether, rougher, more savage, and far removed from the divine favor that once surrounded their forebears. They were not smiths of divine weapons, nor allies of gods, but a lawless race of giants scattered across the mountain caves of distant lands, each one living alone, ruling his family with no concern for order or justice. Their nature was wild, and their customs primitive, untouched by the hands of civilization. The original Cyclops were born from the union of Uranus and Gaia, sky and earth, and their names, Brontes, Steropt and Args, meant thunder, lightning, and bright, capturing the fierce energy they would one day shape into the thunderbolts of Zeus. These three, born with a single round eye in the center of their foreheads, were cast into the depths of Tartarus by their own father, who feared their strength. There they remained imprisoned alongside the 100-handed giants, until the great war between the Titans and the Olympians brought them back into the light. Urged on by their mother, they aided Cronus in overthrowing Uranus, but he too turned on them and cast them once again into the underworld. It was only when Zeus rose against the Titans that he freed the Cyclops, and in return, they gave him the weapons that would secure his victory. The thunderbolts for Zeus, the trident for Poseidon, and the helmet of invisibility for Hades. These were the gifts that changed the tide of battle and marked the Cyclops as divine craftsmen, forever linked to the power of Olympus. After their liberation, they served Zeus faithfully, working deep within the heart of the earth. But even their loyalty could not shield them from the revenge of Apollo, who, angered by the death of Asclepius, struck them down. Yet some say that it was not the original three who perished, but their sons, lesser Cyclopes, who had taken up the forge after their fathers. Either way, their fate was sealed in the shadows of divine sorrow, and their tale became one of both power and punishment. As time passed, the image of the Cyclops shifted. No longer only the smiths of the gods, they came to be seen as something more primal, more ancient, more brutal. In the Homeric world, they appeared not as servants of Olympus, but as monstrous shepherds who lived far from the laws of men and gods. These were the Cyclopes of the Odyssey, giants who roamed the hills of Sicily, each one ruling his own cave with brutal authority, living with his wives and children, taking what he wanted from the land. They did not build cities or temples, did not gather in councils, and knew no government. The earth gave its fruits to them without the need for sowing or ploughing, and they lived on milk, cheese, and flesh, needing nothing more. They were strangers to agriculture, strangers to laws, strangers to mercy. Each man was a law unto himself, his strength the only rule, his cave his kingdom. Among these savage beings, Polyphemus stood out as the most dreadful, not only for his strength, but for his appetite for human flesh. unlike the older tales which left room for nobility and craftsmanship. The Homeric Cyclops were raw and terrifying, and they cared nothing for the will of the gods. Polyphemus mocked Zeus and devoured strangers, confident in his own power, unbothered by divine wrath, until tricked and blinded by a wandering man of cunning speech. Later still, the Cyclops were remembered not as shepherds, but as smiths again, this time as assistants of Hephaestus, the god of the forge. Their home was said to be in the burning caverns beneath Mount Etna, where the hammering of their tools rang through the mountains, and the glow of their fires lit the night. They made armor and weapons for heroes, shaping metal with such force that the very land shook beneath their work. Their number grew in these stories, no longer only 3, but perhaps 7 or even more, each one a master of fire and steel, shaping the tools of war for gods and mortals alike. They lived beneath the volcano, far from the world of men, but their work was felt everywhere, in every clash of sword and shield, in every stroke of divine vengeance. And so the Cyclops were many things across time. At first, they were divine children locked away for their power, then smiths whose work crowned gods in victory, then monstrous herdsmen who tore men limb from limb, and then again hammer-wielding giants beneath the mountains. Their identity changed, but always they remained outside the order of human life. Giants who knew no law but their own, eyes blazing with strength, hearts driven by appetite or craft, and lives wrapped in shadow and fire. Whether feared or honored, they stood apart, their stories echoing through caves, through war, through storm and myth, shaped and reshaped by poets and seers, remembered for their eye that saw only one truth, that power, once unchained, cannot be easily forgotten, that in the Homeric poems, the Cyclops were no longer confined to 3 alone, nor were they bound solely to the southwestern edges of Sicily, as once believed. Over time, their number grew, and their dwelling was moved across the island, shifting from west to east, spreading their presence to new places with new names. Though 2 of the old names, Bronte and Steropes, remained, recalling the thunder and lightning of their ancient deeds, new names also entered their story. Pyracmon, whose name burned like fire, and Acamas, rugged and unyielding, joined their ranks in later poetry. These new names signaled a shift, not only in who the Cyclops were, but what they represented. For no longer were they simply the wild giants of myth who devoured men, or the elder smiths who forged weapons for the gods. In later stories, they became builders, craftsmen, not of arms, but of walls, mighty walls made of stone, so massive and irregular that no mortal hand seemed capable of their creation. These were not the same Cyclops that Odysseus had encountered in his long wanderings, nor the firstborn of the earth who gave Zeus his thunder, but a different people entirely, a race that came from Thrace, bearing the name of a king once called Cyclops, from whom the tribe took its title. These Cyclops, driven from their homes, wandered to Crete and then to Lycia, and later followed the exiled king Proetus to the land of Argos. There, to protect him from his rival Acrisius, they built fortifications of such size and strength that the walls seemed drawn from a dream. The fortresses of Tiryns, Argos, and Mycenae, which still stood in later times as ancient monuments of mystery, were said to be their work. They were called Cyclopean walls, so massive in construction that the blocks sometimes stretched 20 or 30 feet across, fitted together not with tools but as if shaped by the earth itself. The stones, polygonal and unhewn, seemed to mock human effort. No explanation was accepted by those who saw them other than that they must have been made by some fabulous and vanished race. too strong and strange to belong to known history. Homer himself knew nothing of these legends, and when he spoke of Tiryns, he called it only a city with walls, not a wonder beyond reckoning. But as time passed and knowledge dimmed, the mystery grew, and the Cyclops were named as the builders, their strength remembered in stone, their myth fused with the land they were said to have shaped. In sculpture and art, the Cyclops were shown not as monsters, but as powerful men, short and wide in build, with a single round eye fixed in the center of their brow. Where other men had two eyes, they had only one, and in some works, the space where a second eye might have been was marked by a single line, as if to show what was absent. Their features were coarse but not grotesque, their expressions grim and focused, often shown mid-work at the forge or heaving great stones into place. They were tools of myth, embodiments of strength without subtlety, and in their solitude and savagery, they stood for something older than cities or laws. Some thinkers, like Plato, believed that the Cyclops were symbols of the first human condition, when people lived without rules or government, shaping their lives only by what they could take or hold. In that raw, uncivilized time, the Cyclops were imagined as the first beings to walk upright, to fend for themselves, to make homes from caves and shape the earth with their hands. Yet this explanation, though thoughtful, could not account for the elder Cyclops, the three born of earth and sky, whose names were not of places or people, but of forces in the world itself. Their story began with Gaia, the earth, and Uranus, the sky. From their union came many children, and among them were the first Cyclopes, Brontes, Steropes, and Arges. These three were not savage shepherds nor wandering builders, but elemental beings, each bearing a name tied to storm and brightness. They were overbearing in spirit and strong beyond measure, and though they resembled the gods in form, they had but one eye in the center of their foreheads. Because of this, they were called Cyclopes, orb-eyed, but their strength frightened Uranus, who feared his children might rise against him, and so, when they were born, he cast them into the deep places of the earth, locking them in the belly of Gaia alongside other monstrous children, including the 100-handed ones. They remained imprisoned until the War of the Titans, when Zeus, seeking allies in his battle against Cronus, freed them from the dark. In return, they gave him thunder, they gave him the lightning bolt, and they gave him the power to shake the sky. To Poseidon they gave the trident, and to Hades the helm that made the wearer vanish into shadow. These gifts turned the tide of the war and crowned Zeus as king of gods, and for a time the Cyclops were honored. Yet their story did not end with triumph. After the death of Asclepius, son of Apollo, who was struck down by one of Zeus's thunderbolts, Apollo's grief turned to wrath. In vengeance, he slew the Cyclops who had made the weapon, or in some versions, their sons. The fire of the forge was silenced, and once again, their name passed into shadow. They were remembered differently by each age, some as helpers of the gods, some as devourers of men, some as builders of walls, some as wild spirits of the land. But always they stood apart, their eye a symbol not only of sight but of solitude, a single point of view that saw the world not as a place of harmony, but as a place of raw power, ruled by the strong, shaped by the will of those who could endure. And so, whether beneath volcanoes, atop mountains, in dark caves, or carved into ancient stone, the Cyclops remained, part myth, part memory, part warning from a time when the world was young and the gods still forged their might from fire and stone. Craft were in their works. And again, 3 other sons were born to earth and sky, the 100-handed giants, and with them came the first Cyclops, fierce and powerful beings with a single round eye placed in the center of their foreheads, and in all else shaped like the gods. Among all the children that sprang from earth and sky, it was these, the 100-handed ones and the Cyclops, who were the most terrible to behold and the most feared by their own father. From the very beginning, Sky hated them. As soon as each child was born, he took them and hid them away deep within the earth, trapping them in her belly and refusing to let them see the light. There in the darkness they lay, hidden from the world, shut away not because of anything they had done, but because their father could not bear the sight of them. This cruelty brought great sorrow to earth, for her children, born of her body, were being imprisoned again and again. The weight of them pressed within her, and her groans echoed through the world. She ached with pain and anger, and in the anguish of her heart, she crafted a weapon of grey flint, an unyielding sickle, jagged and sharp. She concealed her plan and spoke in secret to her other children, the Titans, urging them to take up the cause and punish their father for his evil. She encouraged them with words, even as her own spirit was tormented, telling them that if they would dare to stand by her, they could repay the shame their father had brought upon her and deliver their brothers from the deep prison he had cast them into. But though she spoke with passion, fear took hold of the Titans, and none of them dared speak. They were silent, unsure, unwilling to rise against the sky that loomed above them. But one among them, the wily and bold Cronus, son of Earth, answered her call. He alone was not afraid to challenge the rule of the heavens, for he did not revere his father, who had acted in shame and harshness. Cronus agreed to the plan, and Earth was filled with joy. She brought him into a hidden place and placed in his hands the sickle she had made. There she explained everything, how he should lie in wait and strike when the time was right. And so he waited. When Sky came down, stretching across Earth to lie with her, Cronus rose from his hiding place and took the sickle in his hands. With one swift, unflinching motion, he struck, cutting away the source of his father's power. The blood fell upon Earth, and from it came other beings, but in that moment the rule of Sky was broken. The Titans rose up and seized the power for themselves, lifting Cronus as their king. One of his first acts was to open the gates of the deep and draw forth the brothers that Sky had cast into Tartarus. Out of the gloom came the Cyclops, Brontes the thunderer, Steripes the flashing, and Arges the bright, and with them the 100-handed ones, great as mountains and terrible in their strength. They came forth from the place as dark as shadow, deeper than night, where they had been locked away, and for a time they were free. The world changed with their release, for these were no ordinary children. The Cyclops, though monstrous in form, had great skill in forging, and in the fire and flame they shaped the weapons that would define the gods. Later, when Cronus himself was overthrown by his own son, it was these same Cyclops who gave Zeus his thunderbolts, forged in the heat of divine flame. To Poseidon, they gave the trident that could shatter the seas, and to Hades, they gave a helm that turned its wearer invisible. Their gifts brought victory in the great war that followed, and for this they were honored. But even so, their fate remained bound to the powers above. In time, when Zeus struck down the healer Asclepius with a thunderbolt, the wrath of Apollo rose, and in vengeance he slew the Cyclops who had forged the weapon. Or as some say, it was not the ancient three who perished, but their sons, less divine, less powerful, but born of the same fire. Whatever the truth, their tale was sealed in sorrow once more. Yet from that moment on, the world would never forget them. In every storm that rolled across the sky, their names echoed, Bronte in the thunder, Steropus in the lightning, and Argus in the flash that followed. They were the flame behind the power of the gods, born of earth and sky, shaped in darkness and freed by rebellion. Their single eyes saw not the world of men, but the forces that made and unmade the world. And so the ancient stories remembered them, not as monsters, but as beings of immense power and great purpose, whose presence was felt not only in the clash of divine weapons, but in the very shaping of the cosmos. From the moment of their birth they were feared. From the darkness of their prison they rose, and though they were cast down again and again, they remained a part of the world's deep memory, tied to the bones of earth and the breath of sky. Their story, wrapped in thunder and sealed with stone, stood as a reminder that even the most terrible of beings can shape the fate of gods, and that in the silence of the earth there are powers older than light, waiting, always waiting, to rise. Once again bound the Cyclops and confined them in Tartaros. These mighty beings, born from earth and sky, had once been freed by Zeus when he rose against the older powers, but now, with the tides of fate turning and new wars shaking the heavens, they were once again cast into the darkness. In the ancient telling, it was said that from the union of earth and sky came many great forces, but among them, none more terrifying in their might than the Cyclops and their 100-handed brothers. The Titan War raged for 10 long years, and when the struggle dragged on with no end in sight, Earth herself gave a prophecy that only by freeing the prisoners held in Tartaros could victory be won. So Zeus, acting on that prophecy, descended into the depths, slew the great jailer who guarded the gates, and broke the bonds that held the Cyclops. In gratitude for their release, they crafted for him the thunder, the flashing lightning, and the blazing thunderbolt, weapons that none could stand against. To Hades they gave the helm of invisibility, and to Poseidon they gifted the trident that shook the seas. With these gifts, the three brothers marched against the Titans, defeated them, and cast them into the very pit that had once held the Cyclops themselves. The 100-handed ones were made the jailers now, standing guard over the fallen foes of the gods. Yet as time passed and the reign of the Olympians settled, the Cyclops did not fade into obscurity, for their craft was unmatched. They became the forge masters of the divine, the tireless hands behind the blazing weapons of Zeus and the eternal symbols of divine power. When Zeus hurled his bolts, forged in the secret fire by the Cyclops, the world trembled and all knew the strength of the gods. In later ages, it was said that they also forged the great altar of the sky, a constellation that marked the place where the gods first came together, made offerings, and pledged alliance before the war against the Titans. This altar, fixed among the stars, became a symbol of sacred promise and heavenly intent. It was said that from this act, mortals too learned to make sacrifice before any great undertaking, seeking the favor of the powers above just as the gods once had. The Cyclops were not only smiths, but builders of divine custom, shaping both weapons and tradition. Their hammering was said to echo through the volcanoes, and their forges glowed deep in the belly of the earth. Some whispered that they never truly returned to the shadows, for the fire of their labor still warmed the breath of the gods. And though they worked with tireless strength, their fate was always entwined with the will of the heavens. When Typhoeus, the last great monster born of the earth to challenge the gods, rose up and roared of rebellion, he swore to undo all that Zeus had done. He would drag Cronus back into the light, tear open the pit, and free the Titans. He would shatter the roof of heaven and bring chaos once more. In this boast, the shadow of the Cyclops' work loomed again, for the fire they lit had not only armed the gods, it had drawn the wrath of those they defeated. The altar in the stars remained a flickering memory of the old war, but even that light could be threatened. And so the story of the Cyclopes carried on, not only in their imprisonment, their forging, or their thunder-making, but in the very balance of power that held the cosmos together. They were creatures of earth and fire, of darkness and brilliance, born to forge the tools of gods and caught in the cycles of rebellion, war, and silence. Even the constellation they crafted, the altar that burned in the sky, was said to bring disaster when it rose. Sailors feared its light, for when it shone, the winds grew wild and the sea rose up in anger. The Cyclops had shaped not only the weapons of battle, but omens of the storm. And while their names faded in time, Arges, Seropes, Brontes, they remained in the sounds of thunder and the flash of fire across the clouds. Their single eye, always watching, had become the symbol of pure focus and unstoppable will. Their chains, broken and reforged, echoed the endless struggle between freedom and control, creation and destruction. Though once freed by Zeus, they had been chained again, for power is never given without consequence. Still, their gifts endured. The trident continued to rule the sea, the helm remained hidden in the depths, and the thunderbolt flew across the sky with unstoppable force. The Cyclops had shaped the destiny of gods, and would continue to shape the world in every storm, in every spark, and in every vow made before fire. They were never truly gone. Their work lived on in heaven and earth, forever part of the stories that thundered through the ages. The Cyclops, sons of Gaia, who worked deep beneath the earth in the roaring forge, shaping the weapons of the gods with thunder in their hands and fire at their feet. These giants of storm and flame labored tirelessly to forge thunderbolts for the king of the heavens, the one who would later rule over both mortals and immortals. In the heart of the forge, where even the stone cried out under the strike of iron, they hammered out the last ray needed to complete a thunderbolt, their glowing tools casting long shadows through the smoke that curled up from the molten metal. Each stroke of their hammers rang with the sound of the coming storm, each spark a whisper of destruction yet to fall. They were the ones who gave the king of the gods his might, the weapons of lightning and thunder that none could stand against. When the gods prepared for war against the old rulers, it was the Cyclops who provided the weapons of victory, their hands the strength behind the new order. In the great isle of Meligunis, which men later called Lipara, they stood at the anvils of Hephaestus, surrounded by glowing bronze and iron, shaping a massive trough for the Lord of the Sea, while fire danced around their feet and the clang of metal echoed from peak to peak. Even the land cried out under the sound. The mountain called Etna groaned. The land of the Sicanians trembled. Italy and her nearby islands rumbled with each rhythmic swing of their massive arms. They stood like mountains themselves, with single eyes beneath heavy brows that burned like glowing shields. And from those eyes came not vision, but force, power, and rage. Their voices were deep like the echoes of the underworld, and their breath came like bellows of fire. The very sight of them made nymphs run in fear. Even those born of the ocean's grace could not bear their thunderous presence or the sound of their furious labor. It was said that even the daughters of the gods looked away from their gaze, shivering despite their immortality. When disobedient children feared the wrath of their mothers, they were warned that one of these forged giants, Arges or Steropes, would come for them, their names enough to hush the loudest cry. And sometimes the ash-covered figure of a trickster god would be sent into the home, playing the role of a boogeyman, smeared in soot and fire, echoing the fearsome shape of those monstrous smiths. But there was more to their craft than thunderbolts and fear. In the ancient tales, the altar forged by the Cyclops stood not just as a symbol of war, but of divine promise. Before the gods marched to fight the old rulers, they gathered around that altar swearing oaths of allegiance, and from that act of unity rose the constellation that marked the stormy season, when thunderclouds rolled in and wind lashed the seas. Its rise in the sky reminded mortals of that sacred time and the power of the storm-born ones who forged it. When lightning struck and the sky roared, it was said to be their voice. Their fire never truly left the world. It lived in the storms, in the deep rumble of the earth, in the glowing sky. When the moon was hidden and the wind howled through the mountains, those who remembered the old tales said, "The Cyclops were awake again, hammering beneath the mountains, working unseen, yet never forgotten. They were born from the earth and sky, shaped by the force of nature itself. And though they were once cast into the darkness of Tartaros, they rose again with the breaking of the old world and the dawn of the new order. Their names became legend, their craft eternal, their place forever between the world of the gods and the roar of the storm. They forged the light that blinds and the fire that purifies. They forged the sound that silences and the power that rules. They were the Cyclops, the thundersmiths, the stormborn, and through them the voice of the heavens was made real. The thunderbolt was already shaped and glowing red with heat as the Cyclops hammered away inside their fiery workshop beneath the ground. The vaults of the forge echoed with each strike of the heavy hammers as Brontes, Sterope, and Paracmon worked side by side, stripped to the waist, their powerful bodies blackened by smoke and flame. Flames danced along the edges of the iron, and the sound of bellows roared through the chamber like a trapped storm. This place was deep within the volcanic island, where the cliffs coughed up smoke and the rocks rumbled with the breath of fire. It was there, beneath the Sicilian earth, that the Cyclops shaped the weapons of the gods, forging bolts of lightning and gifts of fire. The earth trembled above them, and the air shimmered with heat as molten metal flowed in troughs, and anvils rang with divine purpose. These sons of earth had long been known for their strength and skill, and their place among the gods was not in court or council, but in the deep and blazing dark where the god's wrath was born. Even when the goddess came to visit, she did not tremble. As a child still carried in her mother's arms, she had been brought to the forge by the will of the fire god himself, that she might be honored with the gift of a bow. When Bronte set her upon his knee, she did not smile with innocence, but reached forth and pulled the coarse hairs of his chest, tearing them out so fiercely that the spot remained bare forever, like a patch of sickness upon the skin. This act, bold and wild, made even the hardened smiths pause, and she, with the spirit of her brother, demanded a bow, a quiver, and a chest to hold her arrows. She declared that if ever she brought down a great beast with her bow, they could feast upon it, for she too was born of the same mother as the one who brought music and plague. The Cyclops, with nods and grins, did as she asked, and shaped for her the curved limbs of a Cretan bow and sharp arrows to match. So she was armed in her youth, not by gentle hands but by the fire-born giants who worked beneath the earth. In another tale, when the ruler of the skies chose to appear in full glory, his decision weighed heavy. He knew the full strength of his lightning, the one used against giants with 100 hands, could not be unleashed without ruin. So he reached for the lesser bolt, the one made not for war, but still born of the same hands, a flame less savage and more controlled. This bolt too was made by the Cyclops, their second gift to him, and with it he descended into the halls of a mortal palace, where even love could be marked by the presence of fire. And while they forged thunder for the king of gods, they also worked the white iron of the Sicilian sea, dipping it into the water to cool its glowing rage. Their caverns were scorched black from the countless hours of flame, and the rocks bore the marks of their labor. These caves were no simple homes, but chambers filled with fire and sound, and the walls glowed as if alive with heat. The forge never slept, and the earth above it always remembered their work. Some said the very island itself was named for the fire god, for his forge and their hammers made it famous. And from above, when the sky cracked with sound and the world lit up in flashes, it was known that somewhere beneath the ground, the Cyclops were still at work, shaping the bolts that fell from the sky. Their names were passed through time. Bronte, who brought thunder, Steropa, who gave lightning its flash, and Pyrrhacmon, whose fires never dimmed. These were the storm makers, the fire forgers, the ones whose anvils rang with the voice of heaven's wrath. Depths of the mountain, the blazing forges of the Cyclops, hidden within the heart of Mount Etna, where fire never sleeps, and the anvils roar day and night with the pounding of hammers. In that endless heat, the earth groans, and the sky above often darkens with smoke, as metal is melted, shaped, and cooled again. The great thunderbolt for the Sky Lord was nearly finished, though still missing a few final touches. They had already shaped it with great care, giving it 3 fins made of frozen sleet that would whirl in flight, 3 of pouring rain that summoned storm floods, 3 more of fire red as rust that sparked with fierce light, and 3 of hurricane winds that howled through the air. These were its wings, the parts that gave it power and speed. But now, in this last stage, the Cyclops were adding the most terrifying parts of all. Flashes of sudden light meant to frighten, the crashing sound that makes whole armies panic, and the burning flames that represent divine anger. Elsewhere, another team worked quickly to prepare the chariot for the war god. They shaped its swift wheels to tear across fields, waking up soldiers and entire nations with their rattle. Some of the smiths were polishing the shield used by the warrior goddess in her fury, a terrible object whose golden surface was textured like the skin of a coiled snake, and upon it were fastened twisting serpents and the awful image of the Gorgon's head. That head, severed but still filled with power, had rolling eyes that turned flesh to stone. But then a powerful command echoed through the forge. The master of fire entered the cavern and shouted to the workers to stop what they were doing. Every Cyclops of Etna was ordered to abandon the current projects and instead focus all their skill and strength on a new task, creating weapons for a passionate hero. The work was urgent, and their best craftsmanship was needed. At once, the Cyclops dropped their previous jobs and split the work evenly among themselves. They poured out rivers of molten gold and bronze and smelted deadly iron in enormous furnaces that breathed fire. The centerpiece of their labor was a giant shield, a massive piece meant to protect a single warrior from all the attacks the enemy could send. They crafted 7 layers of metal, each one fused perfectly to the next, forming a shield that could not be pierced by spear, arrow, or sword. Some Cyclops manned the bellows, drawing in cool air and forcing it out in bursts that fanned the flames hotter. Others took the sizzling metal and dipped it into troughs to cool. The whole mountain groaned with the sounds of metal against metal, of fire roaring and anvils ringing with constant strikes. They moved in a rhythm that shook the earth, lifting their arms again and again as the hammers struck the glowing forms. The iron was never left alone, always in the tight grip of tongs, always turning and being shaped. And far above this hellish forge, Mount Etna rumbled in pain, spewing fireballs and melted rock across the lands of the Cyclops. Often the fields around the volcano were swallowed by the outpour of fire, as if the mountain itself could not contain the fury born deep inside it. Again and again, the forges thundered beneath the earth, fed by bellows of oxhide that sent wind rushing in and out, dipping brass and bronze into water that hissed like serpents. The labor continued without rest, in heat so great that the rock glowed, and in rhythm so precise that their arms rose and fell like a single living thing. In that fire-lit chamber of gods and monsters, the Cyclops kept the ancient arts alive. According to some, the very craft of shaping bronze had been theirs first, and others claimed it was they who discovered how to mold and shape iron. These were no simple laborers. They were the first masters of metal. At night, their master oversaw them, watching with care as the thunderbolt took shape, ready to be handed once more to the sky's ruler. The sound of their toil echoed through the valleys, bouncing off city walls and stone hills. In their dark moments of rest, some Cyclops, their skin blackened by smoke, walked into the nearby sea to wash the furnace heat from their bodies, steam rising as fire met salt water. And so they labored, deep within the mountain, forming fire into weapons, shaping storms into objects of war, and forging the fury of the gods into things that no mortal could stand against. To the land and lent their great strength and skill in building. In the land near the retreating edge of the Sicilian Sea, close to the narrow, dangerous straits, where the waves crashed wildly against the shore, stood a massive crag feared by all sailors. Not far from there, another land of equal dread rose up, marked by sharp rocks and deep caverns that echoed with the sound of crashing tides and hidden storms. In this dark and powerful place lived the mighty ones known as the Cyclopes, beings like Acamas and Peragmon, who roamed unclothed and burned with the fire of their forge work. These giants, with limbs thick as tree trunks, were known not just for their size, but for their labor in the flames, where the work of gods took form. There came a time when even the ruler of the sky, tired of unleashing his wrath through bolts of flame, admitted that his power was growing quiet. For the hands of the Cyclops were growing weary, and the fires beneath the earth no longer roared with the same fury. Yet even in those days, when cursed objects were demanded, they worked again, together with other ancient craftsmen like the Telchines, who were also famed for their mastery. They joined their skills in a contest of strength and cleverness, though the burden of the task still fell heaviest upon the one who ruled the forge. The molds they shaped in the furnaces of Sicily left even the strongest Cyclops exhausted, their arms aching from the repeated swings of their heavy hammers. The noise of their effort echoed louder than the rumble of Etna itself, and no lesser sound compared when the Cyclops worked shoulder to shoulder, shaping gifts of war and defense. Beneath that mountain of fire and smoke, inside the volcanic caves, the ringing of iron on anvil never ceased, and the heat of molten metal never faded. The one who forged for the gods called to them again, and they came willingly, for in their hearts burned the secrets of creation taught to them by the Master himself. They were his hidden hands, working where no mortal eye could see, but their works shaped the fates of both gods and men. These were the same beings who, long before, came to aid in the building of the great walls. When the earth groaned under strife and the people cried out for peace, the Cyclops answered by raising fortresses with their bare hands. At the command of the sky god, they lifted stones so massive that no other race could move them. They built walls for the city of Tiryns, walls that stood tall and proud, fitting for the line of Darnos. So beautiful and strong were these walls that they were called the work of the Cyclops, the very seat where they had left their mark. Even the old songs and forgotten lines remembered the city as the Cyclops' dwelling, walled and guarded by their strength. It was said they built Tiryns for Proetus, the king, and made it a stronghold so powerful that it could withstand any threat. In the region beyond Nauplia, strange caverns and twisting tunnels lay hidden, known by many as the Cyclopean labyrinths, vast and mysterious. These places held the name of their creators, carved into the memory of stone. 7 of them had come to this land by invitation, bearing no titles but that of their trade. They were known as belly hands, for their food came from the work of their hands, and their survival depended on the skill of their craft. They were no mere beasts or monsters, but craftsmen whose every swing of the hammer fed them, whose calloused palms shaped the very earth. The stories said they did not come by force or conquest, but by request, and when they arrived, they changed the land. The mighty walls of cities and the dark strength of hidden caverns were all shaped by their labor. Their name became a mark of something unbreakable, something built not for beauty alone but for lasting strength. In every land where such walls stood, people whispered of Cyclops, as if the stones themselves carried memories of those one-eyed giants who once lifted and placed them with ease. From the fire-lit caves of Sicily to the high cities of Greece, their mark remained, etched in both myth and stone, in forge and fortification, in every place where strength met skill and where the hands of giants shaped the dreams of gods and men. The Cyclops who had forged the thunderbolt that struck down the healer. But these were not the original 3, for those sons of the sky, born from the union of earth and heaven, were immortal and untouchable, continuing their work in the deep forges of the gods. The ones struck down by Apollo were said to be their children, lesser in name but still born of fire and anvil, and known to some as Euryalus, Elytrius, Tracheos, and Halimid. Their blood stained the stone where they had once shaped the weapons of storm, and their forges fell silent for a time. Yet their fathers, Brontes and Sterops and Gyes, carried on the sacred labor, shaping bolts for the king of the skies. Still, their creations had not only destroyed mortals, but also sparked fury among the divine. Elsewhere, their work stood in stone instead of fire. In Argolis, the ruins of cities told their story. Near Nauplia, old caverns were said to bear their name, their shadows still present in the echo of wind between stones. At Mycenae, massive gates remained, flanked by lions carved in stone, and these were remembered as the work of the Cyclops. Just as they had raised the walls of Tiryns, huge stones, untouched by chisel, had been lifted and placed so tightly that even time could not break them. It was said that not even a pair of strong mules could shift the smallest one, and yet these beings, with one eye and the strength of giants, had stacked them with ease, setting smaller stones between to bind the mighty blocks like sinew binds bone. Their skill was not just in metal, but also in stone, in shaping the boundaries of kingdoms and protecting the cities within. At Argos, beside the shrine of the river god, a head of Medusa carved in stone still watched with lifeless eyes, another of their works. Even in Pausanias's day, long after their hammers had gone cold, travelers still pointed to the remains of Tiryns and said the Cyclopes built them. The towers of Mycenae too stood unbroken, defiant against siege and time, just like those of Tiryns. In later writings, it was believed they had also invented towers themselves, according to the words of Aristotle, as recalled by Pliny. The Cyclops were remembered not only for their labor, but for shaping the very concept of strength in defense. Their stoneworks had become a symbol. In tragedy and epic, poets called them again and again, evoking the might of their hands, the walls they raised, the rocks they moved. The very name Cyclopean came to mean something so large and strong that it must have come from beings beyond mortal reach. In plays and stories, warriors dreamed of bringing down even these massive walls, seeing their defeat as the mark of true strength. In Tiryns, now silent and empty, people still showed the tall towers, saying they were built by the sweat of Cyclopean brows. And in Mycenae, poets called the walls a garland placed by the Cyclops themselves. Even as they passed from the world, their legend remained carved into the earth. But not all stories of them were of building. When the healer was killed by the bolt they had shaped, his father, furious with grief, struck down the Cyclops in return. This act of vengeance did not fall on the first ones, who were eternal and bound to the gods by fate, but on their sons, who had learned the trade and continued the craft. It was said their deaths marked a pause in the storms, a silence in the forge, a moment when thunder did not answer the skies. In ancient arguments, there was confusion over this tale, how beings so divine could also fall. One writer asked how they could be like the gods and still be slain by another. But the answer lay in the generations. The fathers endured, but the sons had fallen. And so the memory of the Cyclopes lived on not just in stone, not just in fire, but in the stories that tied the heavens and the earth, the forge and the wall, the storm and the silence that followed. Their tale was not only of might, but of creation and destruction, of service to gods and punishment by them, of work so great that time itself still bows before it. In every ruined gate, in every stormy sky, and in every whisper of ancient myth, the Cyclops remain. Assembly and hammer out for Dariades the spears of war with Hephaestus' fire. They shall beat out shields broad as a city wall. They shall craft helmets from whole hills and forge axes that echo with thunder. The Cyclops, those giants with a single blazing eye in the center of their brow, were not only known for their work at the anvils of gods, but also stood as warriors of towering might. When the god of the vine marched to war across the wide lands of India, he called upon many to fight at his side, and among those who came in answer were the Cyclops, storm-born sons of the earth. They came down from their mountain homes, where fire burst from caves and the sky echoed with the clang of their forges. They brought no common spears or swords. Instead, they hurled boulders and jagged peaks torn from the roots of the mountains. Their shields were slabs of rock, too massive for any mortal to lift, and their helmets were carved from cliffs, the very tops of mountains worn like crowns. Flames trailed behind them, sparks danced on their arms, and their steps left scorched paths. They held brands of burning stone, glowing with the heat of the fire they lived beside. Each blow they struck rang like a thunderclap. Among them were Brontes, whose name roared like the storm, and Steropes, whose flash rivaled the sky's lightning. With them stood Euryalus and Eletreus, and also Argus and Tracheos, their muscles hard as bronze and eyes glowing with fury. Halimedes was among them, proud and fierce, his hammer hand never resting. These were the same beings who had once given fire to the heavens, shaping the thunderbolts that split the clouds. When the healer was struck down by a bolt, it was they who paid the price. Apollo, burning with grief and rage, had turned against them, loosing his arrow not at the king of the gods, but at the hands that had made the fatal weapon. Some said he used a single shaft, One he later buried in a mountain of the north, far from all eyes, a place of silence and wind. Others whispered that the arrow was lifted by the breeze, returned by fate, and placed among the stars as a mark of sorrow and rage. For his act, the god was punished. The one who ruled the skies raised his hand in fury, ready to cast the rebel down into the dark pit where no light ever reached. But the mother of the god, Leto, pleaded with soft words. And so, the god of light was not thrown into the abyss, but instead made to walk among mortals, his glory hidden, his powers hushed. He served a king, tending flocks, a servant with a god's heart. It was said that the fields he watched grew rich and green, blessed by his hidden presence. Those who lived in that land never knew that their shepherd once held the sun in his gaze and fire in his voice. And the Cyclops, though some had fallen, lived on in story and forge. They still shaped the weapons of the gods, their anvils ringing beneath the mountains, the fire of the earth lighting their homes. In war they returned, not as blacksmiths only, but as giants of battle, their arms swinging stone and flame, their eyes burning like the stars. Even kings from far lands wished to harness their strength, not to kill them, but to make them build the tools of war, to raise walls of stone and shape metal into terror. They were more than creatures of brute power. They were the force behind the storms, the echo in the mountain, the fury of the forge. Though they had no armies of their own, when they moved, the earth trembled. When they struck, the sky listened. And so their tale was not only of punishment and revenge, but of fire and creation, of war and labor, of light shaped by hand and wrath shaped by heart. They stood between gods and mortals, builders of walls and breakers of stone, and in every thunderclap that rolled across the sky, their hammer still rang. Head with a rocky hammer, the king wavered, still upright yet unsteady, as if the earth itself were tipping beneath his feet. Around him, the battlefield crackled with false thunder and flashed with forged fire, for the Cyclops, though children of earth, mimicked the sky. Brontes, whose name meant thunder, shook the plain with a sound like the sky's own voice, but made from hollow bronze trumpets and reverberating steel, a mocking echo of the heavens. His hammer, once used at the forges of gods, now broke bones and split helmets, and every swing seemed to ring with the roar of thunderclaps. He didn't wait for storm or cloud to fight for him. He created them, forging mock rain with steam and ash that fell in burning drops upon the enemy ranks, a rain that seared instead of soaked. His strength seemed drawn from the very mountain, his body moving like a living furnace. Steropes, flashing with lightning, wielded a weapon that blazed and faded, a light not from the stars but from beneath the earth. He held it like a bolt from the sky, yet it was born not in the clouds, but in the fire tunnels of Sicily, shaped not by sky-born gods, but by hands that knew volcanic breath and molten stone. He swung his fiery brand with precision, its glow hidden, then revealed like a storm's sudden burst. It blinded, it scorched, it mimicked the lightning that once split titans apart, and with each strike, it left trails of flickering sparks upon the battlefield. Argilipos, another Cyclops with a flashing eye, lit the battlefield with fire, not daylight. His torch glowed brighter than the sun, and those who faced him could barely stand, their swords wilting beneath the heat of his flames. He moved like a beacon of fury, showering the enemy with fire arrows, each brand falling with a hiss and a burst, setting flesh alight and breaking shields like dry wood. Around him, flames danced as if alive, and the Indians, unused to such fury, stumbled back in fear, thinking the heavens had turned against them. These Cyclops were not only forgers of the gods' weapons, they were now wielders of destruction in their own right. In this strange war, mock gods walked among men, and their fury was no less real for being artificial. Though the thunder was forged, it deafened just the same. Though the lightning was copied, it burned just as fiercely. Brontes again lifted his hammer high, and the mountain answered, a dull boom echoing through the valley as if the forge of Etna itself had come to battle. He did not hesitate, and when his great iron hammer met flesh, the sound was like the ringing of anvils, not just in noise but in impact. Bone cracked like brittle metal, and limbs fell limp where once there was strength. Then he ripped a crag from the side of a mountain, a piece of stone so large it would have taken 100 men to move it, and hurled it like a spear. The target was the king of the dark-skinned warriors, a man of towering pride and unmatched fury, but no match for the raw power of earth-born giants. The stone struck his chest like a falling star, and the king reeled, all air and fight knocked from his body. His spear, once held with unshakable grip, tumbled from his hand. His shield, painted with symbols of war, dropped with a dull thud. His knees bent under the weight of the strike, and his strength faded like the final beat of a distant drum. But before he fell completely, the river itself rose. His father, the god of the waters, swept him away from the brink of death, hiding him beneath waves and reeds, carrying his broken form to safety. The Cyclops stood there, rock dust on his arms, his breath heavy, his hammer hanging low for a moment before he raised it again, ready for more. Around him, the air still burned from his fury. The field, once a place of swords and spears, had become an anvil. The warriors of the East had come prepared for men, but not for beings who moved with the power of the forge, who brought fire and stone as their weapons, and whose rage came not from the sky, but from deep within the earth. The war raged on, but the memory of the Cyclops' fury would burn into the land, their thunder rolling through the mountains, their fire never fully fading. They were not gods, and yet they had become something even gods once feared. The creators of divine weapons, now wielding that creation in their own hands, no longer in service, but in vengeance, in battle, and in fire. Rock and hurled it with force that shook the earth beneath him, a force that seemed to come not from his arms alone, but from the deep roots of the mountain itself. And when the stone left his hand, it spun through the air like a star torn from the sky, roaring as it flew. The battlefield was filled with chaos, but when the pointed rock struck the round of the king's chest, it broke through his armor and sent him crashing down from his tall chariot. He fell with a loud thud, his limbs spread like a fallen tree, and the great metal of his gear clanged against the hard earth as the dust rose around him. The warriors of his army, shocked by the sudden collapse of their leader, rushed to his side, lifting him quickly back into the car, their hands trembling with fear, not just for his life, but for what might come next. For they had seen the one who struck him, a Cyclops so immense and dreadful that he seemed carved from the mountain he had just attacked with. Bronte stood tall, his size like that of Polyphemus, and on his forehead a single eye gleamed with a terrible light, round and full like the face of the moon. The dark-skinned soldiers stared at him in awe and terror, thinking that perhaps the moon herself had come down from the sky and found a place in the giant's head to protect the wild god who led them. In the heavens above, the father of the gods looked down and laughed at what he saw. His own storm had not raged that day, and yet the sky echoed with thunder, and the ground was soaked with strange showers, not of rain, but of earth-flung stones and battle-shaken sweat, a new kind of storm rising from the land and not falling from the sky. As one Cyclops shook the earth, another raised his head into the clouds. Trechios, fierce and wild, marching into battle with Elytreus by his side. Elytreus carried a shield that looked like a whole cliff face, and in his hand he held a fir tree towering like a mast, and with this makeshift spear he swung wide, cutting through rows of warriors and knocking heads clean from shoulders with each sweep. Near them was Euryalus, another of their kind, who charged into a band of retreating enemies, forcing them down toward the sea, where the crashing waves offered no shelter. He trapped them at the water's edge, and while they struggled to escape, he drove a huge blade through the surf, piercing flesh and bone beneath the foam. Then he split off a rock from the coast with his axe and hurled it into the fleeing crowd, and those not shattered by the stone were dragged down by the sea, their bodies lost to both land and sky. Their stories ended without graves. Amid the fury came Halimedes, taller than the rest, storming across the field, his massive form darkening the sun. He shielded his single eye with a round ox-hide barrier, moving through the fray like a walking fortress. But there, watching him, was Phlogios, the archer, the avenger of his fallen people. He drew his bow, set his sharpest arrow, and aimed for that glaring eye. The bow creaked, the string stretched, the arrow flew, but the Cyclops saw it coming and shifted just in time, the shaft missing its mark and slicing through empty air. Enraged by this failed attack, Halimedes reached for a stone and threw it with all his might, but Phlogios had already moved, standing by his king's car, and the missile crashed to the ground just where he had been. But the insult burned within Halimedes, and so he opened his mouth, a mouth wide enough to swallow storms, and unleashed a terrible roar. That one single sound carried the rage of the mountains and the fury of the forge. It blasted forward like a wind of death and struck 12 men at once. Their hearts stopped, their minds drowned in the shock of the noise, and they fell where they stood, lifeless before they could even scream. The battlefield echoed with the cries of the Cyclops, a sound so loud that it reached the slopes of Olympus, shaking the sky and making even the heavens shudder. Their war cry was like the pounding of hammers on anvils, like the groaning of the earth during an earthquake, and it made the bravest tremble. They were not just creatures of strength, but of sound, of stone, of fire and fury. They were monsters, yes, but more than that. They were the voice of the mountain, the heat of the forge, the storm that rises from below, not above. Their rage was not blind, but guided by ancient fury, by old bonds and new revenge. And as they fought, they made the world remember that the Cyclops were not just servants of thunder, not just hands that shaped bolts for the gods. They were warriors in their own right, fighters whose every move changed the land beneath them, whose every shout bent the air, whose every strike left stories etched in stone. In this great war, they had come not as shadows from the past, but as giants reborn, rising again to shape not weapons, but fate itself. The great war of the god of wine raged across land and sea, and among the many strange and powerful allies who fought for him were the towering Cyclops. As the battle reached the coastline, these monstrous beings known for their great strength and single blazing eye joined the fight by sea. They were not sailors in the usual sense, but they navigated the waters with force and fury, launching their attack from the rocky shores. Their weapons were not made of bronze or iron, but of the very earth itself. Massive stones, pulled from the cliffs and mountains, were hurled by their mighty arms like thunderbolts thrown from the sky. Euryalus led the war cry, his voice booming louder than any storm, while Halimedes, who stood so tall he seemed to touch the sky, charged forward with fury that stirred the sea into a roaring tide. As waves crashed and ships shuddered under the weight of battle, Steropes entered the front line, a Cyclops known for his lightning-fast strikes. His massive body moved through the battlefield like a walking mountain, and he crushed anything in his path. Halimedes, not content to fight with fists alone, found the jagged top of a sea-worn cliff, wrenched it free from the earth and hurled it with unshakable force. The stone, shaped by years of brine and wind, flew like a missile and struck a ship mid-voyage. The hull shattered upon impact, and the wooden vessel groaned as it sank into the water, taking its terrified crew with it. The sea swallowed the wreckage as if it had never been, leaving behind only foam and fragments. The Cyclops, usually known for their work beneath volcanoes or in smoky forges, had now become terrors of the sea, turning battlefields into graveyards with the simple act of lifting and throwing earth. Far from the battlefield, in the land of Corinth, a more peaceful reminder of these beings still stood. There was an ancient altar there, weathered by time, which people still called the altar of the Cyclops. Offerings were made upon it, not in fear, but in reverence, for the power of these creatures had once shaped the myths of gods and men. In another city, Megara, there stood a citadel that carried the memory of the Cyclops as well. It was said to be built by Alcathous, and within it was a hearth sacred to gods known as the builders before. These were believed to be none other than the Cyclops, for it was said that Alcathous had sacrificed to them before laying the first stone of the Great Wall. That wall stood tall and strong, and many believed it could only have risen through the hands of such mighty beings. But the Cyclops were not only builders and warriors. In other times and tales, the word Cyclops became a name not just for the mythical giants, but also for men who had lost an eye. One such man was Antigonus, the son of Philippus. He had only one eye, and because of this, people called him Cyclops. Though he was no giant, the name reminded all who heard it of the towering figures from ancient tales, creatures of fire and stone who could change the fate of war with a single throw. On the battlefield, as the war of the god of wine spread like wildfire, these Cyclops showed what it meant to be creatures of both creation and destruction. Where once they had forged lightning for the king of the gods, now they rained down stone upon the ships of their enemies. Where once they built walls that could not be broken, now they tore down vessels with their bare hands. The sea boiled around them, not from heat, but from the sheer force of their fury. And yet, in temples and on altars, in stories whispered by the fire, and in the naming of one-eyed men, the Cyclops lived on, not just as monsters, but as symbols of raw, unshaped power. Their single eye, glowing in the center of their forehead, saw not just the world, but the fear and awe it left in its wake. Their hands, whether forging blades, building walls, or hurling stones, shaped the very myths that defined the ancient world. And in the chaos of war, as ships sank and cities remembered, their legacy remained, etched not only in the rocks they threw or the walls they raised, but in every place where strength left its mark.